Again, welcome to the virtual Moritz College of Law, and thank you to our partners and speakers out there this evening. It looks like the waiting room has slowed down just a little bit. So without further ado, I'm going to spotlight Dean Lincoln Davies from the Moritz College of Law to kick off tonight's session.
Thanks so much, Bill. Great to see everyone. Good evening and welcome, as Bill said, to the virtual Moritz College of Law, or if you're me, the actual Moritz College of Law, where I'm sitting. This evening, I'm delighted to kick off this celebration of the launch of America's Peacemakers, the Community Relations Service and Civil Rights. I want to acknowledge the great work of our preeminent program on dispute resolution and divided community project in putting this program together. Consistent with the program's collaborative spirit, I'm also thankful to our co-sponsors from the Negotiation and Mediation Clinical Program, Stanford Law School's Gould Center for Conflict Resolution, and Menlo College. This afternoon, we gather to celebrate the work of Grande Lum and the late Bertram Levine. I understand that Mr. Levine is the author of the first edition of this book, Resolving Racial Conflict, the Community Relations, Service, and Civil Rights, 1964 to 1989. Mr. Levine's work, which examines the 25 years of CRS's history, has long provided a valuable historical perspective on civil rights mediation, one that has aided creative mediators and dispute resolution practitioners, as well as those who have worked at the Department of Justice's Community Relations Service. With the permission of the Levine family, Grande has worked to supplement resolving racial conflict by developing America's Peacemakers. Grande has added 5 thoughtful chapters focusing on first, free speech in Skokie, Illinois; second, CRS's response to prevent unfounded violence after 9/11; third, Elian Gonzalez; fourth, demonstrations following the death of Trayvon Martin in Sanford, Florida; and fifth, the expansion of the CRS mission beyond race into hate crimes with the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act. Grande used Mr. Levine's first edition as a guidepost when he served as the director of CRS in the Obama administration, and to inform his work as the first director of our own Divided Community Project. I'm certain CRS's future leaders will use his new work to chart the trajectory of CRS moving forward. In just a moment, we'll enjoy a brief presentation from Grande about CRS work. Thereafter, Sarah Cole, our Moritz Chair in Alternative Dispute Resolution and a director of our dispute resolution program here at the College of Law, will facilitate conversation with David Levine, one of Mr. Levine's children, Kerry, Meadow of UC Irvine, Alonzo Emery of Harvard, Janet Martinez from Stanford Law, and our own Dean and Professor Emeritus, Nancy Rogers. Following their remarks, we will turn to discussion and conclude with a virtual toast to Grande and the Levine family at about 6:10. Grande, we're looking forward to your remarks.
Thank you very much, Dean Davies, for that really thoughtful introduction. Very much appreciate that. I do want to thank the entire Divided Community Project team. They have been so supportive and in convening this book launch party, which, I'll give as Dean Davies just said, I'll be giving a short presentation followed by a lineup of truly incredible speakers. For academics, that's a party. I'm really, as people are digging in, I'm really overwhelmed. I mean, I'm seeing colleagues and friends and strangers and family, and on my big Zoom checkerboard, and it's incredibly touching. I can't imagine. I mean, I can't imagine saying that BC before COVID, but we are in this new world here. I really do want to thank the sponsors. Each of the institutions, it's been a home for me. I got my passion and the adventure at the nexus of civil rights and conflict management started at Harvard. Stanford and Jan really provided a home laboratory to try to work on new innovative projects. Ohio State gave me a job when I needed one, and they've provided, I think, the best dispute resolution community I could ever hope for. and Menlo College, and I see a number of my colleagues from Menlo College, which is really wonderful today as well. And it's really been, I'd say, an idyllic oasis with devoted colleagues and just amazing students. And they've provided hope for the future in ways, in a time where we've been in a desert of national polarization, and it's been wonderful. So this is a party. I know we're going to have feel free to have your drink early. I'm going to wait until after I'm done here. But I want to now share begin the presentation, and I'm going to share my screen right now. And can you all see the cover of the book? Awesome. I know this is a perfect week. The book has been starting to arrive. Some of you have actually gotten the book. I still don't have a copy of the book. The only thing is, luckily, my wife, Nan, who's on the screen today as well, she ordered one. And I thought initially, why'd you order one? I'm going to get 10. And she very smartly realized that she would more likely get the book before I did. So she has saved me more times than I care to share. So, and it's wonderful to have my wife here today as well. The title is America's Peacemakers, Community Relations Service and Civil Rights. As Dean Davies said, it really is the story of a relatively unknown, right, for most people, a small federal agency within the Department of Justice, which I think has really been advancing civil rights for more than 5 decades. And it's been doing that in the South, in 1964 to desegregate hotels and other public accommodations, in Selma to help protect the civil rights marchers going across the Pettus Bridge, in school districts throughout the 1970s on desegregation, in Skokie, Illinois, when faced with a Nazi in a Chicago suburb, to Stanford, Florida. And we have some colleagues who actually did some work in Stanford, Florida here as well, in really working with, after the death of Trayvon Martin, working with the protesters to making sure that they could do so, exercise their First Amendment right to free speech. I'm also thrilled, by the way, to see a number of CRS folks on the call today. I don't see everybody right now, but I do see Tim Johnson. I see Ron Wakabayashi, people who have been legends at CRS, and I'm so grateful that they've joined us as well. I can't see everybody. There's several screens up there. I see Daphne. That's great, Daphne. Wonderful to see you as well. That's why I really wanted to write this book. It's about the people who've been at CRS for so long. They were brave and courageous in this work. They sometimes, and I certainly write about it, they had guns pointed at them in their work. They had death threats against them, and they've done it in anonymity and without publicity. In the epigraph of the book, I have a quote by John Lewis at the very first page, and he spoke very highly of CRS, and he certainly spoke about good trouble, right? The late Congressman John Lewis, and he talked about good trouble. I think what CRS did was help it from becoming bad trouble or bad peace as well. And I would never have even tried to write this book had there not been an edition written by Bertram Levine, the late Bertram Levine. We're so fortunate to have his children, David and Neo, and I think Susan may be on the call as well. And we're going to hear from David because there was so much history. I would never even imagine trying to write 55 years of history. The first book was entitled Resolving Racial Conflict. And that was because at the time, that's all it could do. In 2009, the jurisdiction expands to gender identity, sexual orientation, religion, and disability. I just wanted to share a picture. This is Bertram Levine. He was the associate director of CRS. He started in 1965. So he was there for much of the first 25 years. And I feel, again, very fortunate that the Levine children gave me the permission to write about this. I'm going to share a few photos. I think it's that were iconic, but also tell a bit of a story, and that's where CRS comes in. This is from the Birmingham Boycott. This was a famous photo when basically there was great violence by police against African Americans. This was an example of Black empowerment, and basically the town of Birmingham, Black families and individuals were boycotting white businesses and successfully got desegregation, de facto desegregation in Birmingham. It was because of a civil rights attorney who Burke Marshall, who was the Assistant Attorney General at the time, who mediated this with Andrew Young. What he said afterward was that mediation was incredibly important to work here, but it was too much work and it was taking away from his litigation. So he thought in 1963 that someone else should be tasked with it. And basically because of that, and because of it was basically because Lyndon Baines Johnson really wanted it, then he put it into the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It was Title 10 of 1964 Civil Rights Act. And basically, I'm not going to read the enacting language, but it was basically that the function of the service was to resolve disputes, disagreements, or difficulties related to discriminatory practices. That was the jurisdiction of CRS. I'm going to just talk through a few major cases. I thought this was a party and I would be listening to and having fun, but I'm going to say a little bit more and then I'm going to turn it over to the wonderful speakers that we have. This was in the march from Selma to Montgomery, right? And you'll see John Lewis at the front of that. In March 7th, 1965, they attempted to cross the Pettus Bridge. And we know what happened. Many people were injured and hospitalized, including the future Congressman John Lewis. And because of that, President Lyndon Baines Johnson called in CRS. This was one of CRS's first major situations, and sent Leroy Collins, the first director of CRS, to work with them. If you've seen the movie or if you know your civil rights history, Martin Luther King comes and they go and they focus on a second march and they go across the bridge, they go to the bridge, and where they're concerned about the Alabama state troopers. Leroy Collins and others at CRS mediate an agreement between Martin Luther King and Andrew Young, and basically to create safe passage. And that was, an important moment in what CRS did. That's Leroy Collins in the middle. You'll also see John Lewis, Andrew, from the left to right, John Lewis, Andrew Young, Leroy Collins, Martin Luther King, Coretta Scott King, and Ralph Abernathy. He was in his role as CRS director. There was a cost to the work. He later ran for senator of Florida. And during that campaign, that photo is used and pasted all over Florida to basically show that he was too liberal. Leroy Collins basically always thought that this was the reason he lost. He had no regrets about it, but it goes to the possibility, even as a mediator, what the cost might be. This was the second director of CRS. It was Roger Wilkins. And you'll see that's Lyndon Baines Johnson there, Roy Wilkins, his uncle as well. He was really important in focusing CRS on the roots of the problems of civil rights and focused on housing issues, media issues. he did face, he went into Watts in 1965 in his CRS role, and as one of the few Blacks in the Lyndon Baines Johnson administration, he would always note that if he was driving and the police came up to him, that he sometimes would have a gun pointed at him. Whereas when his white colleagues, when he traveled with Cyrus Vance, for example, they would not have that. They would not have that issue. But Wilkins was incredibly important in really pushing forward CRS. This is Dick Salem. Dick Salem was a mediator who mediated when the American Indian movement took over Wounded Knee in 1973. He later wrote one of the first mediation textbooks for lawyers with Nancy Rogers, who of course is on our Zoom session today. And again, I want to focus on the mediators and all the work that they did. Dick Salem, in addition to doing the work at Wounded Knee, was involved in the case that, for those who are lawyers, certainly remember the Skokie case, in which there was a constitutional right for Nazis to free speech. And in that situation, basically there was an American Nazi, a man named Frank Collin, who had demanded the right to protest in Chicago. Chicago turned him down, and he went after Skokie. And the attorney the ACLU attorney who worked with Frank Collin was a man named David Goldberger, who later taught at Ohio State Law School, and he was representing him. Every party felt that this would lead to bloodshed. This is, reminiscent of what was Charlottesville recently. And Dick Goldberger really, his job was to fight for the right of free speech, to have a protest in Skokie, which was a Chicago suburb with a high percentage of Jewish residents and Holocaust survivors. And Frank Collin was adamant about the protests. He felt, and he made these three very, very extreme demands for him to agree not to protest. What changed everything, and I had the chance to talk to David Goldberger, the ACLU attorney. He said it was purely because Dick Salem, the man pictured here, asked the question, what if we didn't meet those demands? Are there any other ways we can find that will prevent you from protesting? And that's what Dick Salem asked. Frank Collin, let me share the picture. Let me share the picture now. That's Frank Collin. He said yes. And at that point, the ACLU attorney said he almost fell out of his chair. He thought there was no way that he would ever back down. But it was because there was a mediator involved that was the case. Peter Salem, Dick Salem's son, said it was nobody wanted to talk to this guy, and you can see why. Right? Nobody wanted to talk to this guy, but a mediator was able to actually create a situation where they could basically save face. Certainly, Frank Collin won the right to protest, but CRS made the difference to prevent bloodshed here. This is Silke Hansen, an incredible mediator for CRS who worked in the Rodney King after the police officer beating of Rodney King in Los Angeles, where she mediated with Korean American groups in that situation. The situation I want to talk about here, what she did, was in the Boston Public Schools. As you know, as many of you might know, there was a Judge Arthur Garrity who was implementing a desegregation order in 1974. And there was, incredible amount of conflict and incredible amount of enmity and adversarialism. Judge Garrity really turned to CRS and said, what can we do? Basically, what Silke did was create biracial councils, and other CRS folks mediated in the schools. And to get a sense of the danger, I'd say, is Arthur Garrity was #1 on the most sort of wanted list, people who were people in Boston. #2 was Silke Hansen, just because she was bringing together Black and white parents here. Arthur Garrity wrote a letter to President Jimmy Carter, trying to argue for more budget for CRS, and basically said that that she had made such a great difference, that Silke had made such a great difference, and said that at that year the CRS budget was $6 million. The budget for security at South Boston High School for 2 years was $10 million during that time, to give a sense of it. This is Thomas Battles. I don't know, Thomas is now with the Divided Community Project. I'm particularly proud. I got a chance to work with Thomas when I was at CRS, and he's been involved. He was involved in Stanford. He was involved in the Elian Gonzalez case, and if you remember, that was a case where Elian Gonzalez was a young boy trying to escape Cuba to get to Florida with his father, and this was, I think, November 21st, 1995, when he tried to cross. When they tried to cross, the father died. The child was in Florida and turned over to his Miami relatives, and there was a fight. There was a fight for that. Thomas played a huge role in trying to create a mediated agreement. Got the two grandparents from Cuba to come over to meet with Elian, and he had an agreement ready with clergy monitoring, traveling back and forth. And Janet Reno was supposed to then go to the house and finish that mediation, because they could not guarantee with 100% certainty that Elian Gonzalez would walk out of that house with Janet Reno. Ultimately, the White House, Bill Clinton, said, no, we're not going to let you go in. But he worked valiantly on it. And unfortunately, as we know, basically federal agents were sent in to go back and pull Elian out. And we remember this famous picture that happened in that situation. Even today, we think about how, I don't know how many of you remember that. I remember this very well, and the high amount of anger within the Cuban American community and within the Miami community. Even, again, you can look at the election and how the Cuban population, the Cuban Americans, still have very strong feelings about Cuba here. Here's the church burning response team, and we have Janet Reno there in the middle, along with Rose Ochi, who was the director at that time. This was the 1990s, when Black churches were being burned in the South, and CRS took the lead in working with the Black churches and trying to focus on prevention here. This is Trayvon Martin, who was tragically killed on February 26, 2012. And this was a big deal, as many of you remember, and with social media and the change as we thought about how Black men and Black young men were being treated by police and others as well. Andrew Thomas, who is part of the Divided Community Project now, who was a mediation center in Rochester director, played a role. He had happened to be working at Stanford and working with Thomas and others from CRS, really worked with the protesters, really worked with the city to make sure that there was a First Amendment right to free speech, worked really hard with white and Black pastors to prevent rumors. And we know there's what's going on today with fake news and all that, but they really worked hard to bring together people, and something that we need to think about today in an era of polarization. And both the protesters, the Dream Defenders, who were a group of protesters at that time, and the mayor really felt strongly about the ability to move forward here. This is a picture from Ferguson, where Michael Brown was shot by a police officer, shot and killed by a police officer. And I remember this one really, really well because of the engagement, as I see Daphne up there, which we worked on, and it was really a difficult one, certainly, as we all remember it. There was a lot of protesting. There was a lot of difficulty. The police response was very difficult. What I remember is this is where we worked. Eric Holder had a very difficult decision to make as the tensions were raising. He decided to go in to Ferguson, and we worked hard to arrange within a very few days, a town hall, a meeting with a pastor, meeting with young people. And I'll always remember because I facilitated a session where Attorney General Eric Holder said, I'm the Attorney General of the United States, but I'm also a Black man. And he talked about himself being stopped by the police. It was really precarious. It was really precarious because the concern was the looting would continue. And if he came and it continued, there'd be huge criticism of Attorney General Eric Holder. And that day, it was quiet and peaceful that night. And I'll always remember the difference that we were able to make, and Attorney General Eric Holder was able to make. I want to end with a picture. This is from 2014. This was the 50th anniversary. This was both past and present mediators at the time, and it was with great pride. Again, I want to focus on the people who really made a difference. Some of you may know Wallace Warfield, who was a CRS mediator who later became a professor of conflict management. He used to always, I think, a couple of things ran through my mind as I was writing the new sections to the book. He often talked about running alongside a conflict, and that maybe a time would come, or maybe a time wouldn't come, where you could make a difference. And I gave you the trailer version. I'm hoping you guys all buy the books. I'm not trying to give up too much here, but is that there are times when you can make a difference. I hope I shared a few examples where that was the case. Warfield also talked about how there's pressure. Pressure is being placed. What are you doing as a mediator or as a conciliator? Where are you directing it? Are you preventing change from happening? That's not the goal, right? What is the goal that you're trying to do? Someone just shared with me something James Baldwin said, which I'm going to end here because I'm hitting my 20 minutes. So he said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed unless it is faced. And I really truly believe that's what CRS was about, that it helped people face the real issues, and I hope in the few stories that I've shared, you can see what difference it can make. So thank you. I can now have a drink, I think, but I'll turn it back to Sarah.
Hey, no drinking yet, Grande.
Okay.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure that you've written this book and given us the opportunity to get together as a community to celebrate you and to celebrate the history of the great work that the Community Relations Service has done. And we really appreciate learning more about the historical context of CRS and look forward to all the good works that it will hopefully have the opportunity to do in the future. We really do have a good lineup and a kind of amazing lineup of people here today. And so I'm going to turn to them now to hear their reactions to America's Peacemakers and to your comments. Bertram Levine, as Dean Davies mentioned, was the original author of the book that Grande has updated. He passed away in 2006, but we're so pleased to welcome his 3 children here today, David Levine, Neil Levine, and Sue Ray, as well as other members of the Levine family and family friends. I'm particularly pleased to turn to David, who is a personal friend of mine, which is an amazing coincidence. He's a retired education professor from Otterbein who specialized in urban education and American educational history and was the founding editor of Rethinking Schools. And we've asked him to share a few remarks about his father's legacy, highlighting his father's work and connecting the dots between our wonderful new author, Grande Lum, and his father. So David, turn it to you.
Well, my job today is to bring a bit of the spirit and soul of Bertram Levine into our virtual room here. And I can do this by sharing a CRS adventure that Dad had. So this story unfolds in May of 1970 in New Haven, Connecticut, where 14 members of the Black Panther Party were on trial for murder. The defense committee for the Panthers organized a rally expecting a big crowd of perhaps 50,000 demonstrators. Justice Department officials were very concerned that this would lead to conflicts with the police, civil disorder, possibly embroiling New Haven's Black community. My dad traveled to New Haven as part of an interdisciplinary Justice Department team charged to see if it would be necessary to call in federal troops. And at that juncture unfolded a dramatic episode that engaged issues of legal justice, issues of civil conflict, and also conflict resolution. I am not going to tell you most of that story. I refer you to chapter 5, When Cities Erupt. But don't be disappointed, because I am going to share a little bit of the story, which not till this moment has seen the light of day. So a few days after this trip that my dad took, I was back with him in his study, a sedate setting of our home in Rockville, Maryland. And Dad knew I wanted to hear the story. I was in my hippie, long-haired, developing a social conscious high school student phase of life. So I can still see him saying, Dave, you would have been fascinated by this. And he then described vividly the impassioned speakers, the interracial crowd at the big rally, the bickering between left-wing groups that reminded him of demonstrations in the 1930s in New York City where he grew up. But the most riveting part of his story was an incident he recounted involving members of his Justice Department team. One early morning, Dad was heading out of the hotel and he saw a group of his colleagues playing some kind of a card game. And he said, hey fellas, I'm heading over to this morning's rally. Anybody like to come along and see what's going on? And his Justice Department colleagues, who may have included Williams Ruckelshaus or John Dean, we'll never know, they were part of the team, said, no, Bert, we're good, but you go on ahead. So I can still see my dad kind of with a wry grin and shake of his head in his upstairs study, marveling that his colleagues would find their card game more riveting than history unfolding just a little bit away. However, through the mists of time, if it had happened that Grande Lum had happened to have been a colleague of my dad's, and in fact, a contemporary, and in fact, playing that card game, I have no doubt in my mind that Grande would have rose from the table, cashed in his chips, and walked across to the green to see the demonstration. And that is because Dad and Grande are kindred spirits. And they both share a deep passion and concern and wanting to be engaged and also be constructive understanders of the important struggles for justice that still grip the United States and gripped it at that time. We're fortunate that Grande and Dad share a few other qualities that grace the pages of this book. They're both vivid writers with a great command of prose. They have the capacity to render complicated episodes of social conflict clearly And finally, despite its charge of neutrality and neutral mediation, they both understood CRS as an important and valiant contributor then and now to struggles for justice and equality in our country. So on behalf of my brother Neil Adlai Levine, my sister Susan Tess-Ray, and myself, I just want to say how grateful we are that they share those qualities.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David. That was just a delightful story. I'm really pleased that you shared it with us. Let's turn now to Kerry Meadow, who probably does not need any introduction to most of our audience, but I will do so anyway. Kerry is the Distinguished Chancellor's Professor of Law at UC Irvine, and I think many of us know her as a global leader in the field of dispute resolution for many years. She was she was at UCLA, followed by Georgetown. She goes back and forth across the country and across the ocean to teach conflict resolution throughout the world. And she is now a professor of law at UC Irvine, as I mentioned. She is a significant contributor to America's Peacemakers as she provided input on the manuscript, and today we'll discuss her views on civil rights mediation in a short period of time. Welcome, Kerry.
Thanks, Sarah. I was willing to cede the time of my introduction so I would have more time to honor this wonderful book. It was my great joy, honor, and privilege to be asked to review the book before publication and to have a little bit of input into the final version. So you heard about my ADR career, folks, but what I'm here to talk about today is my career before ADR, and that was as a civil rights activist and a litigator, and later a mediator. And this book, as I said in my review, should be absolutely essential reading for anyone in the conflict resolution field, anyone in the civil rights field, and anyone who cares. Our next speaker will talk about that, about social justice. So I began as a litigator suing the Philadelphia Police Department for its police brutality. And I want to reference in my brief remarks that almost everything I have to say about what happened in history, whether for me beginning in the 60s or continuing to the present, unfortunately, is still with us. The theme of this book, which is so wonderful for all of us, is, as Wally used to say, you can run alongside the conflict, but also our goal as mediators, and I have never been one to buy the neutrality mantra, more on that later if you want, is to use mediation as one of several tools to achieve social justice. And this book is that story. It was particularly touching for me because I have worked with many of the people described in this book, as many of you on this call have. I worked with Dick Salem, not as close as Nancy, but I did. Roger Wilkins was a dear, dear friend in Washington, who I worked with for many years in DC. And Wally Warfield participated for many years. I think some of the people in this call were in that group, in a salon that I led in my house on conflict resolution readings for about 10 to 15 years. And I urge all of you, whatever community you're in, we could do it on Zoom. This book should be the first one at the top of a conflict resolution mandatory reading list. And I just want to say why. The stories in here, whether they are about the horribly violent events in Selma, police brutality, Trayvon Martin's killing, or the Elian Gonzalez mediation, which I played a tiny role in, having been asked to train Janet Reno to be a mediator. I'm happy to talk about that offline, not in the recording here. We see the span of ways in which civil rights injustices occur. They can be seriously violent events, they can be peaceful protests, they can be protests that were peaceful that went violent, as in Charlottesville, and resulted in death. But this book tells us that for those of us who care about social justice, it is also important to stop the violence, or more importantly, even to prevent the violence before it begins. And for those of us who, like me, have also worked, like the Divided Communities Project, Bravo, on trying to foster deliberative communication in troubled communities, there is no time like the present for needing our skills. And looking at the case studies and the stories in this book, I'm going to teach with it. I would have any student reading this book take every case study and pull out of it particular tools and methods that worked in particular settings, and those which may not have. So this book provides us with an incredible opportunity to learn inductively from reading these case studies and saying, what worked here? What intervention by some of the brilliant mediators who are on this call, and those some no longer with us, like Wally, Dick, and Roger, all departed, my friends, they all work differently. And sometimes things worked and sometimes it didn't. And if our field as mediators can do anything, it could be to use this work and try to extract lessons from those interventions that mediators have that work and those that don't. Always, in my view, from my perspective, remembering what values we bring to the dispute. So for me, those values are always to prevent violence. My grandfather was a pacifist in World War I in Germany and cut off his pinky to avoid going into the army. So I come from a long line of activists for peace, being active. Sometimes a little protest and violence and activity, action is necessary to make justice, but at the same time, to avoid as much as we can harm, illness, and human death. And I think in the present time of extreme conflict, we've just more or less not quite survived a very, very contentious election period. Nothing could be more important than the stories that are in this book. And I'll just end by saying how timely it is. This book was so important to me because knowing some of these people, but not knowing all of the details of the history of CRS, just spoke to me about the value of knowing history and knowing the past stories and realizing these issues are always with us. So think about Mahatma Gandhi's inspiration to Martin Luther King. And then if you haven't looked at it lately, take a look at Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing and see that the conflicts between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X as different ways of trying to achieve racial equality are still with us today. And I became a mediator because I like to sit in the middle of those disputes, both the intellectual ones about how we should act and how we should think, but also in the middle to try to bring people together. So thank you, Grande, for not only this wonderful book, but your personal embodiment of the values in this book. And if anybody on this call hasn't read this book, go read it immediately. And those of us that are teachers, use it and teach with it. Thank you, Grande, and thank you all for coming today.
Thank you, Kerry. That's really, I wrote down some notes, so I will use the book next time I teach a class where I can do that. That's wonderful. Now we will hear from Alonzo Emery, one of Grande's friends, a lecturer on law at Harvard Law School. Alonzo was formerly the Associate Director of East Asian Legal Studies and previously worked at the Harvard Negotiation and Mediation Clinical Program, where he worked with Grande and with CRS to develop and implement dispute systems. And today, as Kerry mentioned, Alonzo will talk about dispute resolution work through the lens of social justice. Alonzo?
Thank you, and my many thanks to the organizers of this event, to the Levine family, to Grande Lum, of course, and of course to the many who work currently or have worked at CRS and who are carrying out the most meaningful work that's described in the book. My brief comments today are really just going to be a reflection of the book from my own personal perspective, which is probably the only perspective I can assume. And I want to try to raise some questions that were raised for me either directly or indirectly through my reading of the text. And these are questions I think about conflict resolution and its intersection with social justice. So I'll start by admitting candidly that as much as I loved and relished the opportunity to read the book, it was at times a very difficult and troubling read. And by troubling, I mean troubling in the most essential and important way, because I think we need to all be troubled now. We need to be reminded of what has been and the work that remains to be done. And I think that's what this book does so beautifully. What this book stirred for me on a personal level was a lot of generational memory and also a lot of firsthand memory of the events that are brought to life through the text. So for example, we are given a ground's eye view of CRS's work and the work of conciliators on the ground working tirelessly in the wake of the burning of Black churches. And this conjured for me stories from my grandfather, who was a sharecropper from Louisiana and part of the Great Migration out of the South to California, who was really fleeing racialized terror and looking for the promised land, looking for an opportunity for his family to develop without that reign of terror hanging over their heads. Now, certainly what he discovered in California was a lot of other challenges, and the book touches on some of those challenges as well. When I was going further through the text and exploring the expansion of CRS's mandate with the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act of 2009, I was forced to face my own personal recollection of the tragic events of 1998. And those were events that helped give life to the legislation, the Hate Crimes Prevention Act, eventually. So in 1998, I was just a teenager. I was beginning to muster the courage to come out when a young man, Matthew Shepard, was tortured and murdered just for being gay, just for being who he was. And what also arrested me in that was the wake of his murder and all the vitriol and anti-LGBTQIA vitriol that was spewed even at his funeral. There was no rest for him, even in death, or no rest for his family. And certainly all that terror, you can be sure, had the result of closing my closet door shut firmly, at least for a few more years. But just months before Matthew Shepard's murder, and I think revealingly less reported by the media, was the murder of James Byrd Jr. He was essentially kidnapped and attacked by 3 white supremacists, brutally tortured and lynched and dragged from the back of their truck for miles while he was alive until his death. So as I said at the very beginning, troubling, extremely troubling to be sure. But I think just as those at CRS did not do in the face of these types of tragedies and cannot do, we can't look away from Shepard, we can't look away from Byrd, we can't look away from George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or so many others. And so for me, it's this uncanny capacity to face discomfort, to face danger, and to face discord that is brought to life again and again throughout the pages of this book, in moments where conciliators would provide service involving neo-Nazis, Klan members, anti-immigration activists. Often they worked with communities who held views that were diametrically opposed to their own. And so while reading, I almost wept. I could almost weep again, thinking about the story of Ron Wakabayashi, who I'm delighted is here today, and who encountered flyers during his work that read immigrant hunting license and things like shoot to kill, and how that echoed and recalled his family's own past and the anti-Japanese flyers that they would read almost with the same statements from the World War II era. And so for me, the book raises so many critical issues and questions about our field. My colleague Whitney Benz, who teaches at the Graduate School of Education, she speaks questioningly about some assumed pillars in our field, the pillars of neutrality, of impartiality, and sometimes of the attempt to divorce our own identity or identities or personal views from the substance of our work. And as we see in both the book's original text and in the expanded text, these were the types of issues that CRS employees were wrestling with from the very beginning. They were perhaps asking, what impact will I have if I insert myself in this situation? How will my identity or identities play into all of this? Does our intervention somehow soften the ferocity of dissent? And if that's so, does it help somehow to support the status quo? And as we do work to quell violence, which for sure is absolutely essential, what impact does that have on longer term efforts to quell the violence against Black bodies and so many others who have suffered for a long time? But rather than place the burden on CRS, which is functioning under a highly specific mandate, I think there are perhaps questions for all of us to consider. These are questions we should all think about. And these were certainly some of the questions I was thinking about while reading and reflecting on my own teaching and mediation practice. So I'll leave here with these open questions and with another hearty call for all of us to read and reread this essential book. Thank you again to everyone for listening to me and for including me in the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alonzo. Those were very thoughtful remarks. And I now heard neutrality mentioned a couple of times, so maybe we'll talk about that in greater detail in the discussion. But let me welcome Janet Martinez from Stanford Law School. She's going to share her thoughts on CRS through the lens of dispute systems design. And Jan is the longtime director of the Gould Negotiation and Mediation Program and the Gould Alternative Dispute Resolution Research Initiative at Stanford. So joining us from the West Coast, where I hope the weather is lovely. Go ahead, Jan.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you to Bill for the invitation, to Moritz for the warm welcome, and for hosting this really important event. It's great, as many of you know, I came out with a book also this year, and you really treasure your colleagues who have supported you along the way. So thank you. As Sarah said, I want to talk about the peacemaker perspective through the lens of designing systems. So in terms of what can we learn from America's peacemakers, and what are the processes and goals and how they fit together as two important elements. So peace is the operative word. Congressman Lewis's opening said, to create a more perfect union. Well, that's a powerful phrase that raises us up, and then we say peace. But what does that mean? And I think CRS has been able to use its singular skills in service to translate the concept of peace into something very concrete. So in terms of system design, I think of six elements, if left to more time. Two is what I'll focus on is first on what are the goals of your system or the process, and two, what are the processes that you use as the mechanism to accomplish that. So in terms of goals of peace, there's cool racial and ethnic tension, facilitate communication, prevent violence, bring order, bring people together, resolve conflict, and prevent crimes, prevent violence. So those are more operationalizable. So thinking about what CRS devotes its training and its professional service to, and thinking about what are the processes that are used as tools in achieving this level of peace. So the operative word for CRS is the word conciliation. And they named their professionals conciliators. But it is a broad scope of operation. It starts with fact-finding, facilitation, mediation, training, which I'm going to underscore especially in a moment, consulting, technical assistance. The training piece is a really important one where CRS has been able to work with law enforcement in the community. In fact, training for the community is, I think in the book, Grande, you say it's the most popular CRS deliverable. So that's a really important component of the mission, given that that's getting ahead of the events and the violence that happen in a community. How can we train, engage with all the stakeholders in the community in a meaningful way so they are equipped to deal with the tensions and not resort to violence? I think one of the next steps that we are in the midst of ourselves today is the digital frontier. So how is the digital frontier going to exacerbate the problems as well as mitigate them by means of us being able to communicate with more people more easily than might have been the case 6 months ago? In terms of the concepts, I wanted to shift into the cases that are highlighted in the book and how these processes have been used. So when we think of the voting rights in Cairo, 1979, a court mediation process helped the parties achieve a governance of a city. Instead of a mayor and a certain board, they shifted it to a city council that was more representative. So this was restructuring the parties in the community to function at a more peaceable level. The Nez Perce fishing issues on the treaty rights unfolded all the way to AIM at Wounded Knee, a very extended process. The de-escalation around Skokie that Grande talked about, a shuttle diplomacy process where the conciliators are able to achieve communication indirectly. In Stanford, after the shooting of Trayvon Martin, how to bring police, community, and civil rights together. And peer mediation in school, and teaching young people how to use their words sooner when conflict arises within the classroom between the teachers and the students, teachers and parents, teachers and community. So I think I want to thank particularly Grande and from CRS, Justin Locke. Both have been sharing their divided community work with my students and me and with my faculty at Stanford. And so here is a mission where we are really trying to equip our students. My students happen to be mostly law students, but broad community residents. How do I act in the community? How do I proact in the community to communicate more effectively? So I think the divided community, I am very grateful to your work. It is life-changing for our students to think in these ways in terms of system and peacemaking in a very concrete way. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. And finally, Nancy Rogers, our own Nancy Rogers, former Dean and Professor Emeritus at the Ohio State University Moritz College of Law, former Ohio Attorney General and founder and leader of our wonderful Divided Community Project, who's worked closely with Grande. Nancy?
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks to all of you. I think that my comments can be shorter because yours were so good. But I have been thinking about the next 3 months. Grande ended his PowerPoint with a picture of CRS as it was when he was director. And it is much smaller now as we face a time of political polarization and also a time of needing to deal with some deeply rooted race and equity issues in the country. There, for the next 3 months at least, we're going to do so with a CRS that's much smaller and perhaps facing some constraints in terms of their intervention. And so the question is, if it falls to us, what can we do in the next few months? As I've talked with people about that, they say, well, you know, I would mediate if you set it up for me, but no one's asked me. And I would say the book has a great deal to say. Read the book. The book has a great deal to say about getting involved, about running alongside, as several of you have said, about whether to be involved. It has a great deal of wisdom. And it also has a great deal of wisdom in the how, in ways that are far beyond simply showing up for a mediation that someone else has arranged, despite the challenges of these communities that are in deep and bitter conflict. So first of all, in terms of whether, you know, it certainly makes clear that waiting for an invitation is not necessary, that you can get involved without that. It also points out that you can get involved somewhat modestly. And that you don't have to do it alone, that you can work with others very effectively. In terms of how, both Levine and Lum in their examples show us how someone who has expertise in dispute resolution, and particularly in collaborative dispute resolution, can see opportunities that really move things. As Jan said, there is a great opportunity for people who know how to train, who know how to train local leaders in some instances for what they can do, how they can play a role, how they can join together, how they can constructively put together statements that will be helpful, how they can put together trusted ways to squelch rumors, how they can connect leaders with their counterparts, how they can convene and facilitate discussions that lead to some progress, if not a settlement of the dispute. So it's of no surprise to you, since our first director was Grande Lum, that the Divided Community Project uses a lot of these approaches that he and David Levine wrote about in the book. We've recently done some seminars, for example, for bar leaders or for faith leaders on how they can speak out effectively and constructively post-election. And you can do that too. And so what I guess I want to say is that Grande, who still chairs our steering committee, and the rest of us would share with you materials, and we would be the consultants if you wanted someone to talk with. But this is a time to think about how you can use your expertise as the book explains in the past, with a robust group of facilitators. How the CRS was able to make a difference. You might consider doing that as well. Of course, some people say, I'm not sure I could make a difference. And I love the last chapter of America's Peacemakers, as it discussed how honestly difficult it is in this field, where you can't always say that what you did was what caused something not to happen. And it is, I think, of some comfort as I read both the new jacket on the book, and the opening, that 3 key civil rights leaders, whose names all of us know, have at various times said that CRS has made a difference, a real significant and important difference in its work. They are the people who are watching. They are the people who had the best guess as to what would have happened absent that participation. And I think that gives some comfort to those of us who are trying in some ways to make some contribution in the next 3 months. It's particularly, I think, encouraging that in John Lewis's opening, which was quoted in the first page of the book, he gives the same statement to the conciliators that I have heard that he also gave to many who were his colleagues in the civil rights movement. Never give up, never give in, keep the faith, keep your eyes on the prize. We are going to build a beloved nation. And so one way to think about building a beloved nation is to begin by reading this book.
Thank you, Nancy. And that's such a nice thought too for all mediators who often wonder whether they've done something in the course of mediating that actually accomplished the goal that they set going in. So I've heard from all, or at least a couple of you mentioned, as I said earlier, neutrality as an issue that is still under debate in terms of mediation. And I guess in terms of the kinds of conciliation efforts that CRS engages in, one question I would ask the panel to think about is, how important is it for an agency like CRS to maintain neutrality as a principle when they enter into these various conflicts? And Kerry, let me start with you, since you were one of the 2 who mentioned neutrality as an issue.
Great question, Sarah. So obviously, I would say role matters, ROLE. The agency was incredibly effective, CRS, when it was effective, because as an agency, it did have neutrality as a core value, and also diversity. I want to just say, I think that is essential. Neutrality can't be seen as everybody being the same. And I didn't see him on the call, but I'm going to quote here one of my mentors and good friends in the field, and that's Howard Gadlin, who I commend to all of you. If you haven't read it, wrote a wonderful piece about neutrality many, many years ago, I believe in the Negotiation Journal. And that is, he described neutrality as a little halo above one's head. It's an aspiration in mediation for us to sit in a place we can be truly, quote, neutral to the parties, but nobody ever aspires to it. And I would say, when I say role, an agency like CRS has to present itself with those values from a government perspective. But I'm not a government mediator. So for those of us who are private mediators, neutrality has, as Howard would say, is something I aspire to in my practice, but I prefer to call it non-bias. That is, I'm a person, as I've said, who spent her life working on social justice issues. I disclose who I am, what my values are. And then if someone wants to invite me in, or as Nancy suggested, if I want to invite myself in to a conflict, people know who I am when they choose to work with me. So I would say neutrality matters depending on what role you're in a dispute. And it depends whether you're a government agency and have to provide some legitimacy for your service. That's why, although offered many years ago, I never became a judge. I don't want to be a judge. I want to be an activist. And the nice thing about mediation is if you disclose who you are and what values you care about, then you can help other people come together to try to work on those values together when they want to. So that's my take on neutrality. It's a little different than the mantra of our profession. Perhaps someone else wants to present the more conventional notion that we all, quote, have to be neutral. I think it's impossible, and I'm proud of that.
Well, let me ask, I want to hear from Alonzo too, who mentioned it, but first, can I ask Grande, as a former director of CRS, what is the perspective of CRS, at least at the time when you were leading it, on neutrality?
I mean, Kerry hit the nail on the head. I mean, you're a federal government agency. I was there when Eric Holder was Attorney General, when Barack Obama was the president. What was new, it was talked about in the cable news, video age. The right, the Breitbarts came after us if there was any perception of not being neutral, that you could not, even if we said the word white privilege at the time, there was, as is going on today, this concern that, oh, you are biased here. It was difficult, but here's what I would say. I would say, like a journalist, the fact that you're putting a spotlight onto something and that you're working, and that the underlying jurisdiction, what allows us our jurisdiction was the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which was about desegregation, which is about equal rights. That's a wonderful place to be. And the many incredible CRS folks who are on the call today will certainly tell you that you were working on things to move things forward, and you had the respect of the police department, of the mayors, of the civil rights groups, because they knew that was why you were there, and you were there to move it forward. Yes, there's compromise. Yes, there's some challenges. A word we haven't used, I would put, is impartiality, as another word to think about, because neutral has some really heavy negative connotations to it. So so as a director, I would say, yes, we're neutral. As a mediator, now no longer of the government, I wouldn't use that word.
Thank you, Grande. Alonzo, you mentioned it too, and I wondered if you had some perspective on that, either from the viewpoint of CRS or general viewpoint of mediators around the world and country.
Just quickly, I mean, you see in the book, and Grande spoke to this a second ago, how important it was to the parties involved that those coming from CRS had a stance that at least projected that they could be fair brokers in helping parties discuss the issues that were contentious. I think one thing I'll echo that Kerry mentioned is I think it is important to lead with what your identity is and even your stance that you're bringing it to the issues. And then to make a judgment as to whether or not you feel like you can remain a fair broker in helping the parties through the process. I think one of the challenges that can come up is as you move through the process in the role of a mediator or a neutral, and find that your neutrality can't be maintained. And so I think that is an issue that can come up. I think a priori, you make some assumptions about your stance, but when you're in it, it can look and feel very different.
Thank you so much. And I'll ask one more question before I turn to Josh for our celebratory toast. And that's a question that came from Bill Waters, and I think it's a really important one. I know that when I first started learning about dispute resolution, I'd never heard of CRS. I don't remember when I did learn about it, but I do think it is very much under the radar, and probably even more so over the last 4 years. And is it the hope that CRS will have a more prominent role in the country, both under the new administration and just in general, because obviously we've had Democratic presidents before, and still CRS has been on under the radar. So how important is it to be under the radar, and or maybe is this a time to change that? And I'll ask Jan first on that, and then anyone else would like to chime in on it.
There are pluses and minuses, right? I think on the plus side, CRS has chosen to be under the radar. They don't have their conciliators featured in newspaper articles and that kind of publicity, because their focus is on enabling other people to engage with each other and learn to live together and communicate. So for them to be featured as the dominant actor to my mind, might undermine the capacity of the really target stakeholders that are really in the middle of things.
Anyone else like to comment on that? Grande, as former director, would you hope to see a more prominent role for CRS, or at least more funding?
I mean,
Yeah,
that was certainly a reason to write the book, right? To get that story out there. Bertram Levine wrote an incredible book, and I just thought, why not? We need to bring this further. There was an attempted basically elimination of the agency. I mean, it's a shell of its former self, no matter how you look at it. I think there's an opportunity for renaissance. I think there is, given what's going on in the country, given the need for healing, the need for understanding, the need to deal with these issues, as Alonzo, I think, really wonderfully framed for us. CRS can have an incredible role, but it requires, just as Nancy put a call out for what we can do in our communities over the next 3 months, I think it's also a call for advocating for CRS to get the staffing and to get the budget in order to deal with. I mean, do we have more? I mean, we could make an easy argument that the polarization division is at levels we have not seen in decades.
Grande, do you have any advice about how to do that? How to advocate for CRS?
We could do a separate session, but on that. But certainly talking to your senators, communicating with a number of folks. If anybody knows anybody in the transition teams, they should talk to them as well. It's budget, right? That's the big thing. Will the Senate bill, the Senate, what will it call for? So I think there's a huge opportunity, and it comes from the civil rights community. It comes from the Black congressional members have always been a big supporter of it as well.
Thank you, Grande. And I would like to turn now to the wonderful Josh Stolberg, a co-director of the Divided Community Project, to offer a celebratory toast for Grande's book.
So I have the honor of leading a toast to Grande and the Levine family. So a little symbolically, Grande has a nicer wine glass than my La Croix can of water here, but let me just say it as I've prepared here. We symbolically raise our glasses to offer the following toast to Grande Lum particularly, and to the members of the Levine family jointly, for their collaboration in advancing the project that resulted in the publication of the book, America's Peacemakers. As several people have referenced, at the 45th anniversary celebration of CRS, the late Congressman and American hero John Lewis observed, I'll quote a different passage, "In a time of unnecessary trouble and disorder, the members of CRS had the capacity and courage to cool the tensions of a nation. You helped to bring order where there would have been chaos. You helped bring peace where violence would have ruled the day." Grande Lum, in elegant, compelling prose, has updated the CRS narrative originally told by Bertram Levine. At a time of heightened citizen polarization, Grande's account vividly recalls and revitalizes the values that have shaped our nation, that individuals have the capacity to engage in reasoned dialogue regarding how best to resolve a shared challenge, and that each of us as citizens has a right to be treated with equal dignity and respect. Those of us gathered here, and particularly for those interested in the study and work of dispute resolution, we thank you, Grande, deeply for reminding us through this history of the bravery, commitment, and decency of both those individuals who provide crucial dispute resolution services and our fellow citizens who exhibit the imagination, decency, and ability to help us move towards a more perfect union. Many thanks.
Thank you.
Here,
Thank you.
here.
Cheers.
I think we have one, if Grande hasn't drunk too much at this point, we wanted to hear one more time from him. Grande, any final comments?
And just, especially since so many people have LaCroix, this is cranberry juice. I have to drive back home. Nan knows this. We lost power today. I was going to do it from home, but because we lost power, I drove all the way to the campus to make sure I could be on the screen. But I just want to say I'm incredibly humbled. I look around the screen and I see so many people who have been my icons, my mentors, my colleagues, and my friends, and it's really meaningful. And I'm so happy to have so much of the Levine family here. And I do want to thank them so much. This has been, like Jan, writing a book it's weird. It's such a solitary thing. And all of a sudden you all appear, and you guys gotta be at the fun part, I think. And I very much appreciate that. But I do echo what Nancy said, that there's much work to be done. There's a lot of challenge, and I know many of you in this around this screen have been working hard on it, and I want to honor you all, and I want to thank you all, and I really appreciate it. So thanks to everybody.
Grande, at the risk of not, I don't want to keep anybody later past time, but I just wanted to share one thought in response to such a lovely toast. Thank you for the hosts and for everyone who spoke. I'm coming to you from rural Maine, and driving up, I was thinking, my dad passed away 14 years ago. And I saw a meme of poll watchers of the current elections, and thinking, it was Elijah Cummings and John Lewis looking down on what's happening today. And I look at this gathering and will kind of add my dad to that, looking down on this group today, and start where you started your talk, Grande, about the people. And what you've done is knit together the people that my dad talked about in the first 25 years and the continuing story. And the event today has brought so many of those people together. The names have rung out. These are folks that I heard around our kitchen table that spent time in the Levine home. Many of you are on the call. I want to say thank you to all the friends and family that are on the call. And so much comes to mind, the need for CRS. The last point I'll give is that David spoke to my dad and Grande being kindred spirits. And I think what comes through in the book so strong is, and I talked to my dad several times about this, what was foremost in his mind writing this book is that he wanted to get the story right. He wanted to tell the tale right. And I think Grande has embraced that. And what my dad didn't live to see is the fact that so many of you who have spoke today that come from academia, that come from the practice, that both the authors, my dad and Grande, said that this story needed to be told. And you've explained to why. You know, the field has evolved over these several decades, and now there is a strong literature, there's a strong serious discipline that backs it up. There is field practice. It's a tremendous addition to the field. Thank you so much for making it a reality and for bringing this community together.
Thanks, Neil.
Thank you so much, Neil. And I'm not sure whether Bill or I are concluding this lovely event, but I think I will. And thank you all so much for coming. I just had a chance to scroll through the gallery, and it's amazing to see so many of our dispute resolution colleagues, as well as the Levine family and friends and Grand's friends. But thank you all for coming, and please buy the book.